September 14, 1945. Fort Stevens, Oregon. The Pacific wind carries salt and pine through the chain-link fence as Hauptmann Marguerite Kohler steps off the transport truck. Her Wehrmacht Meteorological Corps uniform faded to gray, the insignia barely visible. She's 31 years old. Her hands, calloused from 3 years of gripping weather balloons in freezing observation posts, tremble as American guards gesture toward the camp entrance. She expects concrete floors, thin blankets, perhaps a single daily meal of watery soup. She expects punishment. She expects to be forgotten. What she doesn't expect is the leather. The smell hits her first in the camp administrative building 3 hours later, rich and earthy, mixed with fresh paper and ink. Captain Robert Morrison, the camp's science liaison officer, slides a package across his desk. The brown paper crinkles. Marguerite stares at it, her throat tightening. She hasn't been given a gift in 4 years. Gifts don't exist in war, not for women in uniform. Not for meteorologists whose data helped plot bombing runs and U-boat movements. Morrison nods toward the package. His voice is neutral, professional. "Open it," he says. Her fingers, still dirty from the transport, fumble with the string. The paper falls away. Leather, deep burgundy, smooth as water. A logbook. Not a logbook salvaged from destroyed equipment or stolen from another department. Not a logbook with pages torn out for cigarette paper or fire kindling. A new logbook, pristine. And on the cover, embossed in gold leaf that catches the afternoon light streaming through the window, her name, Marguerite Kohler. Meteorological observer. She stops breathing. Her vision blurs. She blinks hard, forcing her eyes to focus, certain this is a mistake, a cruel joke, something that will be snatched away. But Morrison is opening another box. Inside, nested in tissue paper, are fountain pens. 3 of them, black lacquer with gold nibs, and beside them bottles of ink, not just black, blue, red, green, for coding data. For distinguishing pressure systems from temperature gradients from wind patterns. For making science visible. Marguerite's hands hover over the pens, not touching them, as if contact might make them disappear. Her mind spirals backward, away from this clean office with its maps of Oregon weather patterns, away from the smell of leather and possibility. Back to 1942, to the Eastern Front. To observation posts where the thermometer froze solid, and she had to estimate temperatures by how quickly her breath crystallized. She remembers writing on the backs of requisition forms, on margins of propaganda newspapers, on flattened cigarette packages. She remembers presenting her atmospheric data to Oberstleutnant Dietrich, watching him glance at her charcoal scrawls on torn notebook paper before tossing them aside. "We need predictions, not art projects," he'd said. "Get better materials," she'd replied. He'd laughed. "You're lucky to have pencils, Kohler. There's a war on." Had she known? Had she understood even then that her work was considered expendable? That the data she risked frostbite to collect, the pressure readings she took during artillery barrages, the wind measurements that could mean the difference between a successful air raid and disaster, all of it was treated as disposable because she was disposable. The pens gleam on Morrison's desk. Marguerite's throat closes completely. Captain Morrison is speaking, explaining something about the camp's weather station, about how Fort Stevens needs accurate meteorological data for coastal shipping forecasts, about how her expertise is valuable. The word hangs in the air. Valuable. She wants to laugh. She wants to scream. Instead, she picks up one of the fountain pens. It's heavier than she expected, balanced perfectly for long hours of writing. The cap unscrews with a soft click. The nib is pristine, untarnished, ready. She hasn't held a proper pen since university, since before the war, since before she joined the Luftwaffe Weather Service because she genuinely believed that science transcended politics, that atmospheric data was neutral, that her observations mattered. She sets the pen down carefully, afraid her shaking hands will damage it. Morrison is still talking. He mentions additional instruments, a barometer, an anemometer, a hygrometer for humidity readings, all calibrated, all maintained. Does she require anything else? The question breaks her. Does she require anything else? As if she's a colleague, as if she's a scientist, as if 3 years of war and capture and defeat haven't stripped away her right to requirements, to requests, to dignity. The sob comes from somewhere deep, somewhere she's kept locked since the surrender. It tears out of her chest, raw and ugly. She presses her hands over her face, horrified, trying to force it back, but another follows and another. Her shoulders shake. Tears slip between her fingers, hot and shameful. She's crying in front of an enemy officer. She's crying over a logbook. She's crying because for the first time in years, someone has treated her work as if it matters. Morrison doesn't speak. He doesn't offer false comfort or tell her to compose herself. He simply waits, and somehow that makes it worse, makes it better, makes it unbearable. When Marguerite finally lowers her hands, her face is blotched and wet. Morrison slides a handkerchief across the desk. American cotton, clean and white. She takes it, wipes her eyes, tries to find words. "I'm sorry," she manages. Her voice is hoarse. Morrison shakes his head. "You've been recording weather data under combat conditions for 3 years with inadequate materials," he says. "That's not something to apologize for. That's something to respect." The word hits like a physical blow. Respect, from an enemy, from a man whose country she helped fight against, from someone who sees her as a scientist first, a prisoner second, a woman third. She looks at the logbook again, at her name in gold. "How did you know?" she asks. "Know what? My name. The spelling." Morrison opens a folder. "Your service record," he says. "Transferred from Luftwaffe Meteorological Corps, Eastern Front, 1942 to 1944. Reassigned to Western Front Weather Stations, 1944 to 1945. Captured near Bremen, May 7th. Your commanding officer's notes indicate you maintained observation logs under extremely difficult conditions. We thought proper materials might be appreciated. Appreciated. Such a small word for such an enormous thing." Marguerite picks up the logbook, opens it. The pages are thick, cream-colored, with pre-printed columns for date, time, temperature, pressure, humidity, wind speed, wind direction, cloud cover, precipitation. Professional, standardized, permanent. She runs her finger down a blank column, feeling the slight texture of quality paper. How many observations had she lost? How many critical data points had vanished because the paper disintegrated in rain or burned in a fire, or was requisitioned for other purposes? How many times had she rewritten the same measurements because the first recording was illegible, the charcoal smudged, the pencil too faint? Science requires documentation. Meteorology, perhaps more than any other field, depends on consistent, accurate, long-term records. Weather patterns emerge over time. Anomalies become visible only when compared against years of data. She'd known this since her first university lecture. She'd known it every time she'd watched her careful observations become unreadable, unusable, lost. And her superiors had known it too. They'd simply decided her work wasn't worth the cost of proper materials. Not when paper was needed for orders, for propaganda, for maps. Not when ink was rationed. Not when a female meteorologist was a novelty at best, a waste of resources at worst. The weather station is about half a mile from here, Morrison says, standing. I can show you now if you're ready. Marguerite closes the logbook carefully as if it might break. She gathers the pens, the ink bottles, holding them against her chest. She's ready. The walk to the weather station takes them through the camp. Other prisoners watch from barracks windows. German soldiers mostly, some Italian, a few Japanese in a separate section. They all wear the same expression, that hollow-eyed exhaustion of defeat. Marguerite wonders if they see what she's carrying, if they understand. The weather station sits on a small rise overlooking the Pacific. It's a wooden structure, painted white, with instruments mounted on a platform. A proper Stevenson screen for the thermometers, a rain gauge, a barometer inside the shelter. An anemometer spinning slowly in the coastal breeze. It's modest compared to some stations Marguerite has worked in, but it's maintained. The instruments are clean. The calibration logs are current. Morrison opens the shelter door. Inside, there's a small desk, a chair, a kerosene heater for cold days, and on the wall a complete set of meteorological charts, pressure maps, wind pattern diagrams, cloud identification guides. You'll take observations 3 times daily, Morrison explains. 800, 1400, and 2000 hours. Record everything in the logbook. If you notice any unusual patterns or have concerns about incoming weather systems, report directly to me. We're particularly interested in storm predictions for shipping routes. Marguerite sets her logbook on the desk. The leather looks almost obscene against the plain wood, too beautiful, too fine. She opens it to the first page, uncaps one of the fountain pens. The nib glides across paper like silk. She writes the date. September 14, 1945. Location: Fort Stevens, Oregon. Observer: Marguerite Kohler. The ink dries quickly, deep black, permanent. She writes her first observation time. 15:30 hours. Then she steps outside to check the instruments. The thermometer reads 17 degrees Celsius. The barometer shows 10-15 millibars, steady. Wind from the northwest at 12 knots. Cloud cover scattered cumulus at 2,000 meters. Visibility excellent. She records each measurement carefully, her handwriting neat and precise. The pen never skips. The ink never smudges. The paper accepts every stroke perfectly. It takes her 15 minutes to complete the observation, cross-checking each instrument twice, calculating dew point and relative humidity. When she finishes, she has a complete, professional, permanent record of atmospheric conditions. Morrison reviews her work, nods approval. "This is excellent," he says, "exactly what we need." Marguerite stares at the page. 3 years of fighting for scraps. 3 years of watching her data be dismissed because it looked unprofessional, because it was hard to read, because it was recorded on whatever materials she could scavenge. 3 years of being told that accuracy didn't matter if presentation was poor. And now, in a prisoner of war camp, in enemy territory, in defeat, someone hands her the tools she'd begged for and tells her work is excellent. The irony is devastating. That night, in her assigned barracks, Marguerite lies on a cot that's softer than any bed she's slept in since 1943. The other female prisoners, mostly nurses and communication specialists, whisper in the darkness. They talk about home, about family, about what happens next. Marguerite holds the logbook against her chest, feeling its weight. She thinks about Oberstleutnant Dietrich, about every officer who'd rolled his eyes at her requests for better materials. She thinks about the supply sergeants who'd laughed when she asked for proper paper. She thinks about the institutional dismissal, the casual disregard, the assumption that her work was somehow less important because she was a woman, because meteorology wasn't combat, because science could make do with scraps. And she thinks about Captain Morrison, who'd looked at her service record and seen a scientist, who'd ordered materials embossed with her name, who'd asked if she required additional instruments. The anger comes slowly, building like a pressure system, not hot rage but cold fury, the kind that settles in bones and doesn't leave. She'd been loyal. She'd served. She'd done her job under impossible conditions, maintaining scientific standards when everything around her collapsed into chaos. And her own government, her own military, had treated her expertise as expendable. The Americans, the enemy, the ones who'd bombed her cities and defeated her country, they'd given her a leather logbook with her name in gold. The next morning, Marguerite arrives at the weather station before her scheduled observation time. The dawn is clear, the Pacific wind steady. She opens her logbook, uncaps her pen, and begins to write, not just measurements, context. She notes the instrument conditions, the calibration dates, the potential sources of error. She adds observations about local weather patterns, about how coastal conditions differ from continental systems she's familiar with. She writes everything she'd wanted to write for 3 years but couldn't because there was never enough paper, never enough space, never enough time. The pages fill with dense, detailed, professional meteorological analysis. When Morrison arrives at noon to check her morning observation, he finds 5 pages of data and notes. He reads slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to respect. "This is exceptional work," he says. "Have you considered publishing?" After the war, I mean. Academic journals would be interested in comparative atmospheric analysis between European and Pacific coastal systems. Publishing, academic journals, as if she's still a scientist. As if defeat and imprisonment haven't erased her credentials. As if her work could still matter in a world that's moved on. "I don't know if German meteorologists will be welcome in academic circles," Marguerite says carefully. Morrison shrugs. "Science is science," he says. "Politics shouldn't determine whose data is valuable." The statement is naive, idealistic, probably wrong. But it's also what Marguerite believed once, before the war taught her that everything, even atmospheric pressure, becomes political. She wants to believe it again. Over the following weeks, Marguerite establishes a routine. 3 observations daily, each recorded with meticulous care. She begins to understand the local weather patterns, the way marine air masses interact with coastal mountains, the fog cycles, the storm tracks. She requests additional instruments, a better anemometer for measuring wind gusts, a sunshine recorder for tracking solar radiation, a maximum-minimum thermometer for overnight temperature ranges. Morrison approves every request. The instruments arrive within days, sometimes hours. Each one comes with calibration certificates, instruction manuals, maintenance schedules. Professional equipment treated professionally. Other prisoners notice. They see Marguerite walking to the weather station with her leather logbook, see her spending hours recording data, see the Americans treating her like a colleague rather than a captive. Some are confused. Some are resentful. A few understand. One evening, a former Luftwaffe radio operator named Hilda approaches Marguerite in the mess hall. She's younger, maybe 24, with burned scars on her hands from a transmitter fire. "I heard the Americans gave you a fancy logbook," Hilda says. Her tone is neutral, testing. Marguerite nods, wary. "They did." "Why?" Hilda sits down without invitation. "Because they want accurate weather data," Marguerite says. "Because they think your work matters," Hilda says. "It's not a question." Marguerite doesn't answer. Hilda leans forward. I spent 2 years maintaining radio equipment with broken tools and salvaged parts, she says quietly. Every time I requested proper supplies, I was told to make do, to be resourceful, to stop complaining. Her scarred hands clench. I got these burns because a transmitter I'd repaired with wire scraps and solder caught fire. The message I was sending, coordinates for a medical evacuation, it got through. Saved 30 men. My commanding officer never asked if I was okay. He asked if the radio still worked. Marguerite meets her eyes. Hilda's expression is hard, bitter, familiar. Did it? Marguerite asks. Work? No, Hilda says, it was destroyed, so I built another one from parts, because that's what we did. We made do. We were resourceful. We didn't complain. And our own people treated us like we were disposable. The word hangs between them. Disposable. It's the truth neither wants to say aloud. That their skills, their expertise, their contributions were valued only as long as they didn't cost anything. That the moment they required investment, resources, recognition, they became expendable. The Americans don't see us that way, Hilda says. I don't know why. Maybe it's propaganda. Maybe it's strategy. But they look at what we can do, not just what we cost. Marguerite thinks about her logbook, about Morrison's question regarding additional instruments, about being treated as if her expertise has value independent of her nationality, her gender, her status as prisoner. It's not propaganda, Marguerite says slowly. It's just basic respect for competence. Hilda laughs, sharp and painful. Then we've been serving people who don't understand basic respect. The observation sits heavy in the autumn air. Around them, other prisoners eat their evening meal, American rations that are better than anything they had in the final year of the war. The irony is everywhere, inescapable. They're better fed, better housed, better equipped as prisoners than they were as soldiers. What does that say about the system they served? What does that say about the people who led them? Marguerite doesn't have answers. She only has her logbook, her instruments, her data. She returns to the weather station, to the work that makes sense when nothing else does. By October, Marguerite's weather observations have become essential to Fort Stevens operations. Her storm predictions are accurate. Her data is reliable. Morrison begins including her in planning meetings, asking her opinion on weather windows for training exercises and supply shipments. She's still a prisoner. She still wears her faded uniform. She still lives in a barracks behind chain-link fence. But when she speaks about atmospheric conditions, people listen. They take notes. They adjust plans based on her analysis. One afternoon, Morrison brings a visitor to the weather station. Colonel James Hartford, the camp commander. He's older, gray-haired, with the weathered look of someone who spent decades in military service. Hauptmann Kohler, he says, shaking her hand as if she's not a prisoner, not former enemy, just a colleague. Captain Morrison speaks highly of your work. Marguerite doesn't know how to respond. Thank you, sir, she manages. Hartford examines the weather station, the instruments, the logbook open on the desk. He reads her most recent entries, nodding slowly. This is exceptional record-keeping, he says. Have you always been this thorough? Always, Marguerite says. Or I tried to be. Circumstances weren't always conducive to proper documentation. Hartford looks at her directly. I've read your service file, he says. Your commanding officers noted that you maintained observation logs under combat conditions. That's commendable dedication. Marguerite's jaw tightens. They noted it, she says carefully. They didn't support it. Hartford's expression shifts, understanding. They didn't provide adequate materials. No, sir, why not? The question is simple, direct, impossible to answer fully. Because paper was rationed. Because ink was scarce. Because a female meteorologist requesting resources was seen as demanding special treatment. Because her work, no matter how critical, was always secondary to other priorities. Because she was disposable. Because they didn't think it mattered, Marguerite says finally. Hartford nods slowly. Their loss, he says, our gain. He turns to Morrison. I want Hauptmann-Kohler's data included in regional weather reports. Coordinate with the National Weather Service. If her observations are this accurate, they should be part of the larger meteorological record. Morrison nods. Yes, sir. Hartford looks back at Marguerite. You're doing important work here, Hauptmann. Scientific work that will outlast the war. That matters. He leaves. Marguerite stands in the weather station, surrounded by instruments that work, holding a logbook that's permanent, processing the reality that her data will be included in official records. Not hidden, not dismissed, not lost, included. That night she writes a letter, not to family, most of whom she hasn't heard from since the surrender, not to friends, scattered or dead, to her university advisor, Professor Ernst Kellerman, who'd encouraged her to pursue meteorology when it was still unusual for women, who'd written her recommendation for the Luftwaffe Weather Service, who'd believed her work mattered. She doesn't know if he's alive, doesn't know if the letter will reach him, doesn't know if he'll care. But she writes anyway, describing the weather station, the instruments, the logbook, describing the devastating irony of finding professional respect in a prisoner of war camp, describing the anger and grief and confusion of realizing that enemy captors value her contributions more than her own government ever did. She doesn't mail the letter. There's no way to mail it, not yet. But she keeps it in her logbook, a record of this moment, this realization, this breaking point. The weather changes in November. Storm systems roll in from the Pacific, bringing rain and wind. Marguerite tracks each one, predicting arrival times, intensity, duration. Her forecasts are accurate within hours. Ships adjust schedules based on her warnings. Training exercises are postponed or accelerated. Her data matters. One particularly severe storm hits on November 18th. Winds gusting to 60 knots, heavy rain, dangerous seas. Marguerite is at the weather station through the night, taking observations every hour, monitoring pressure drops, tracking the system's movement. Morrison arrives at 300 hours, soaked from the rain. You should rest, he says. I need continuous data, Marguerite replies. The pressure gradient is unusual. This storm might intensify beyond initial predictions. Morrison stays, helping her check instruments, record readings. They work in professional silence, two meteorologists focused on atmospheric dynamics that don't care about nationality or politics. By dawn, the storm passes. Marguerite's predictions were correct. The intensification happened exactly as she'd calculated. No ships were caught unprepared. No damage occurred beyond minor flooding. Morrison reviews her night's work. Pages of detailed observations recorded in steady handwriting despite exhaustion and storm conditions. This is some of the best field meteorology I've seen, he says quietly. Thank you, Marguerite says. She means it. Not for the compliment, though that matters, for the night, for treating her as a colleague, for the implicit acknowledgement that her expertise is real, valuable, worth respecting, for the devastating gift of being seen as a scientist first. They walk back to camp through the post-storm dawn, the air washed clean, the Pacific calm again. Marguerite carries her logbook, its leather cover damp but intact, its pages filled with permanent records of atmospheric conditions. She thinks about all the data she lost during the war, All the observations recorded on scraps that disintegrated or burned or were thrown away. All the knowledge that vanished because it wasn't considered worth preserving. And she thinks about this logbook with her name in gold that will be archived. That will become part of the official meteorological record. That will outlast the war, the defeat, the prison camp. That will remain as proof that she was here, that she did this work, that it mattered. The anger is still there, cold and permanent, the grief too, but underneath something else. Not quite hope, not quite peace. Maybe just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that this time, finally, the data will survive. That this time, her work is being treated with the respect it deserved all along, even if it took capture, defeat, and imprisonment to find it. Even if it came from the enemy. Even if it reveals the devastating truth about the system she served. Marguerite Kohler will spend the next 2 years at Fort Stevens, recording weather data with meticulous care. Her observations will be included in National Weather Service archives. Her storm predictions will save lives and property. Her work will be cited in post-war meteorological studies. And every time she opens that leather logbook, every time she uncaps one of those fountain pens, she'll remember this moment, this breaking point, this confrontation with the reality that sometimes the people who defeat you see your value more clearly than the people you served. It's a truth that will shape the rest of her life, bitter and liberating in equal measure. The weather doesn't care about politics. Atmospheric pressure doesn't recognize borders. Science, real science, transcends the human conflicts that try to claim it. Marguerite knew this once, believed it deeply. The war taught her it wasn't true, that everything, even objective data, becomes political. That expertise is only valued when it's convenient. That women in uniform are disposable. But here, in this prisoner of war camp, with a leather logbook and fountain pens and instruments that work, she's learning something else. That maybe, sometimes, in small moments, science can be just science again. That competence can be respected for its own sake. That the tools matter because the work matters, because knowledge matters. It's not redemption. It's not justice. It's not enough to erase 3 years of being dismissed and disregarded. But it's something. And on this November morning, walking through the Oregon rain with permanent records of atmospheric data, it's enough to keep going. Enough to keep observing. Enough to keep believing that somewhere, somehow, the work still matters, even if it took losing everything to find people who understood that.